They handed him a wooden training rifle, not as a joke, but because it was all they had left. Imagine surviving deserts, mountains, prisons, and borders, only to finally reach an army that can offer you nothing but a carved block of wood. Most men would have snapped. Most would have taken it as a sign the war was already lost. But not him. He took that wooden rifle and turned it into a promise. A promise that would echo through the mountains of Italy and shake the foundations of one of World War II's most brutal battlefields. Let's rewind to September 1939. Poland didn't just lose a battle, it was crushed between two steel jaws. Nazi Germany stormed in from the west with mechanized fury. And just weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east under the cover of a secret pact the world wouldn't fully understand for years. In 17 days, a nation ceased to exist. But its people, they refused to vanish. Thousands of Polish soldiers, officers, and civilians began one of the most harrowing escapes in modern history. They fled through forests, across rivers, over borders that shifted by the day. Some went south through Romania. Others risked the frozen north. Many didn't make it. Those who survived found themselves scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Stateless, homeless, but not hopeless. By 1940, the British had agreed to form Polish military units from these refugees. Training camps sprouted up in places like Palestine, Egypt, and Iraq. Far from the European front, far from home. One such camp sat baking under the relentless Middle Eastern sun. Rows of tents stretched across sandy ground. Water was scarce. Shade was scarcer. And weapons? Almost non-existent. In 1941, in that very camp, a young Polish volunteer stood in formation for the first time. His uniform was mismatched. His boots were worn through at the heels. And when the supply officer handed him his rifle, he stared down at a length of carved wood, smoothed and shaped to approximate the weight and dimensions of a real weapon. He wasn't alone. Dozens of men around him received the same thing. Some laughed bitterly. Others cursed. A few simply stood in silence, gripping their wooden props like they might transform into something real if held tightly enough. But this young soldier, let's call him what his comrades would later call him, though few knew his name at first, this future legend looked down at that wooden rifle and made a choice. He decided it didn't matter what he was holding. What mattered was what he would become. Enter General Stanislaw Sosabowski. If you know anything about the Polish Parachute Brigade or the battles that followed, you know this name. Sosabowski was a man carved from granite and pure stubbornness. He was brilliant, uncompromising, and utterly relentless. Where other commanders might have made excuses. We don't have equipment, we don't have time, we don't have support. Sosabowski simply worked harder. He believed that discipline, intelligence, and willpower could overcome almost any disadvantage. And so he drilled his men like no one else. They trained in the brutal heat until they could barely stand. They practiced formations with wooden rifles until every movement was muscle memory. They studied tactics, learned fieldcraft, and absorbed every lesson Sosabowski hammered into them. You will not be ordinary soldiers, he told them. You will be better than those who have real weapons. Because when you finally hold a real rifle, you will already be warriors. The young volunteer absorbed every word. He wasn't the tallest in his unit. He wasn't the loudest or the most physically imposing. But he had something else, a kind of quiet, burning focus that made others take notice. He trained with that wooden rifle like it was the only thing standing between him and death. He learned to move through terrain without sound. He practiced timing, patience, observation. He became a student of war in a classroom made of sand and deprivation. And slowly, the wooden rifle stopped feeling like a mockery. It became a tool, a teacher, a reminder of how far he'd come and how far he still had to go. By 1943, the Polish II Corps, now armed with real weapons, real equipment, and hardened by months of grueling preparation, was deployed to the Italian front under British command. The Allies were pushing north through Italy, trying to break through the German defensive lines that snaked across the mountainous landscape. And at the center of those defenses sat a target that had become a symbol of Allied frustration. Monte Cassino. It wasn't just a hill. It was a fortress. A mountain crowned by an ancient Benedictine monastery, surrounded by steep slopes, minefields, barbed wire, and entrenched German positions. The terrain itself was an enemy. Jagged rock, deep ravines, and mud that swallowed men whole. 3 previous Allied assaults had failed. The Americans tried. The British tried. The New Zealanders and Indians tried. Thousands died on those slopes, and the monastery still stood, watching over the valley like a silent, immovable sentinel. When the Polish II Corps was assigned to take Monte Cassino, the reaction from Allied command was mixed. Some were grateful for the reinforcements. Others were skeptical. "These are exiles," they said. "Refugees cobbled together from camps. How much fight can they really have left in them?" Sosabowski heard the whispers. His men heard them too, and they said nothing. In the days before the assault, the young soldier, now a battle-tested fighter, no longer gripping wood but cold steel, prepared himself mentally and physically. He cleaned his rifle with the same care he'd once given to that wooden training prop. He checked his ammunition, his gear, his route up the mountain. He studied maps by candlelight, memorizing every ridge, every possible line of fire. Around him, his comrades did the same. There was no bravado, no grand speeches, just the quiet, methodical preparation of men who knew exactly what they were walking into. They knew the odds. They knew the history of this place. But they also knew something the doubters didn't. They had survived worse than this. They had walked across continents with nothing. They had trained in deserts with wooden rifles. They had rebuilt themselves from the ground up. Monte Cassino was just another test, and they intended to pass. May 11th, 1944. The final assault on Monte Cassino began under the cover of darkness. Artillery thundered across the valley, shaking the earth. Smoke and dust filled the air, and through it all, the Polish soldiers began their climb. The slopes were even worse than expected. Loose rock shifted underfoot. Barbed wire snagged uniforms and skin. Mines detonated without warning, sending shrapnel screaming through the air. German machine gun nests opened fire from elevated positions, raking the hillside with devastating accuracy. Mortar rounds dropped into clusters of advancing soldiers. The mountain seemed to reject every attempt to climb it. Men fell. Units scattered. Communication broke down in the chaos. And yet the Poles kept moving. This is where our soldier became something more than a name. As his unit struggled to advance through a particularly brutal section of the slope, a narrow ravine choked with wire and covered by overlapping fields of fire, panic began to set in. Men were pinned down. Officers were shouting conflicting orders. The advance was stalling. And then he moved. Not recklessly, not wildly, but with a calm, surgical precision that seemed impossible given the circumstances. He identified the German machine gun position responsible for most of the fire. He studied the terrain, noted the timing of the bursts, and plotted a route that would take him through the killing zone in the brief seconds between salvos. Then he went. He moved like water through rock, low, fluid, impossibly fast. He reached cover just as the next burst tore through the space he'd occupied a heartbeat before. From his new position, he signaled to a nearby squad, directing their fire to suppress the German position. Then he moved again, closer, flanking the nest from an angle they hadn't anticipated. When he finally reached the position, his actions were swift and decisive. The machine gun went silent. His unit surged forward. This wasn't an isolated incident. Again and again throughout the assault, this soldier appeared where he was needed most. He didn't lead from the front like a Hollywood hero. He led by example, by precision, by being exactly where chaos needed order. When a minefield blocked an advance, he carefully marked a safe path through it while under fire. When a German counterattack threatened to overrun a position, he organized a defensive line that held long enough for reinforcements to arrive. When confusion reigned, he cut through it with clear, decisive action. His comrades began to notice, then his officers, then soldiers from other units who heard the stories filtering back through the ranks. They started calling him the one-man guillotine. Not because he was brutal, though he was effective, but because of the way he operated, swift, exact, and final. When he made a decision, there was no hesitation, no wasted motion. He cut through problems the way a blade falls in a single, perfect stroke. By May 18th, after days of grinding combat, the Polish forces were closing in on the monastery itself. The Germans, realizing the position was no longer tenable, began a fighting withdrawal. But the mountain still had to be taken, meter by meter, through rubble and smoke and the ghosts of all who died trying before. The one-man guillotine was there for the final push. Exhausted, filthy, operating on willpower alone, he and his comrades clawed their way up the last slopes. They cleared the final defensive positions. They stepped through the shattered ruins of the ancient monastery, walls that had stood for over 1,000 years, now reduced to broken stone and memory. And at 10:20 a.m. on May 18, 1944, a Polish flag rose over Monte Cassino. The battle was over. The impossible had been done. Victory came at a terrible price. The Polish II Corps suffered over 900 killed and 3,000 wounded in the assault. Each name represented a life, a story, a family, a future that would never be. In the cemetery that now stands near the monastery, Polish graves stretch in quiet rows. A memorial bears words that still echo. We Polish soldiers, for our freedom and yours, have given our souls to God, our bodies to the soil of Italy, and our hearts to Poland. The soldier who once held a wooden rifle walked through that cemetery in the days after the battle. He saw the names of men who'd trained beside him, who'd shared rations and jokes and fears. He didn't speak much about what he felt. Few of them did. There's a kind of grief that goes beyond words. News of the Polish achievement spread quickly through Allied command. Suddenly, those same officers who'd whispered doubts were asking different questions. Who are these soldiers? How did they do what 3 other Allied assaults couldn't? What made them so effective? The answers were simpler than anyone expected. These were men who had lost everything and rebuilt themselves from nothing. They weren't fighting for glory or conquest. They were fighting to reclaim the right to exist, to return home, to prove that Poland hadn't died even when it was erased from maps. They were led by officers like Sosabowski who demanded excellence not as a preference but as a survival requirement. And they were forged in places where wooden rifles were all that stood between a refugee and despair. As for our soldier, the one-man guillotine of Monte Cassino, his story didn't end on that mountaintop. He continued to fight through the Italian campaign and beyond. He survived the war, though many of his comrades did not. And when the war finally ended, he faced a cruel irony that haunted so many Polish soldiers. They had fought for freedom, but their homeland remained behind the Iron Curtain, controlled by the very Soviet forces that had invaded from the east in 1939. Many Polish veterans couldn't return home. Those who did often faced persecution for having fought alongside the Western Allies. Our soldier, like thousands of others, found himself in a strange position. a hero with no homeland to return to, a warrior whose war had no true ending. Some settled in Britain, others scattered across the world. They carried their memories, their trauma, and their pride quietly, often unrecognized by the nations they'd helped liberate. But here's what endures from that story, what makes it worth telling decades later. Equipment doesn't create a warrior. The soldier who stood in that dusty camp in 1941, gripping a wooden block carved to look like a rifle, could have given up. He could have seen that makeshift weapon as proof that his cause was hopeless, that he was expendable, that the world had already written him off. Instead, he saw it as a beginning. He understood that the weapon in his hands mattered far less than the strength in his mind, the discipline in his training, and the purpose in his heart. By the time he held a real rifle, he was already dangerous, not because of the steel and gunpowder, but because of what he'd become while preparing with nothing. That's the real story of Monte Cassino's one-man guillotine. It's not about superhuman ability or Hollywood heroics. It's about what happens when determination meets discipline, when necessity forges excellence, when men who have every reason to quit decide instead to become something the world never expected. Somewhere in a museum, or perhaps lost to time, that original wooden training rifle might still exist. Scarred, weathered, anonymous. If you saw it on a shelf, you might walk right past it. Just a piece of carved wood, unremarkable, clearly not a real weapon. But if you knew its story, if you knew that men trained with such things in the desert heat, that they learned to fight with precision and discipline while holding props instead of weapons, that they went on to achieve what better equipped forces could not, then that wooden rifle becomes something else entirely. It becomes a symbol of potential, of what we can become when circumstances force us to rely on more than tools and equipment. It reminds us that the most powerful weapon any soldier, any person, can carry isn't made of steel or technology. It's conviction. It's discipline. It's the refusal to let circumstances define your limits. They handed him a wooden training rifle in 1941. By 1944, he stood at the summit of Monte Cassino, a mountain that had broken armies, a fortress that had seemed impossible to take. He left training as an under-equipped refugee, a man the world had already counted out. He returned from Monte Cassino as a legend, as the one-man guillotine, as proof that warriors aren't born from privilege or perfect conditions. They're forged in the fire of determination, shaped by discipline, and tempered by purpose. And sometimes, they start with nothing more than a piece of carved wood, and the unbreakable will to become something more.